Hey folks, welcome to this month's edition of the Contact Center Network, where I'm joined by the awesome Mark Williams and equally as awesome Russell Groves, where we're tackling the topic of leadership, not leadership, well, that might come up, but training and development in a remote and hybrid world. So Mark and Russell will introduce themselves and give their plethora of credentials about the topic. And we've got some really interesting questions and things to tackle as part of today's session. So if you've got any thoughts or reflections on training and development in your world, or if you're joining with a particular burning platform or topic of interest that you'd like to chat about, this is as much of an interactive webinar as you can get. So your voice is the most important one. No disrespect to either of my guests, Mark or Russell, but hearing from the people on the front line who are going through remote training, inductions, whichever is coming up, we want to hear from you, because if we can offer some advice or some tips or some suggestions as part of this platform, then absolutely brilliant. We love feedback and we love questions, so please do share. But before I go into the meat of today's topic and start firing questions at Mark and Russell to kind of really uncover how we break the back of some of the challenges that maybe some people are having with remote learning and hybrid learning in that setting, I'm just going to hand over to Mark and Russell to give your introductions, a little bit about your background and your experience, and introduce you to the Contact Center Network. So we'll start with Mark. Hello and welcome.
Thank you very much, Gary, and hello, everybody. So yeah, I'm Mark. I have been involved in L&D for well over 25 years. The last 21 years of those running my own training and coaching business, working predominantly with senior teams around high-functioning teams and developing coaching cultures. And in the last 5 years or so, I have been setting up a second business just to keep me on my toes, developing a learning platform that is specifically for training providers and coaches and facilitators to extend the learning journey beyond the sessions that they run with the actual facilitators themselves. And that's absorbed me for the last 5 years. Brilliant.
Cheers, Mark, and welcome to the panel. Russell?
Thanks, Gary. Thanks, Mark. Yes, and thanks for calling me awesome. It's been a while since...
I use that word far too much, so I'm not being indiscriminate.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you. Russell Groves, founder at Training Sensei. I've not had as long as Mark in the L&D space. I first got involved with an e-learning company in 2010. And since then, so I've seen it from multiple sides. I've worked at an e-learning company. I've then been a coach stroke trainer in a consulting capacity. And then in 2019, I took myself out of the traveling the country realm and started Training Sensei, where we have created a learning platform that is specifically geared towards businesses that they have HR function, but they're not yet big enough to have a learning and development function. And what we're trying to do is sit in the middle, in that space where we can assist a HR person to deliver the same kind of training programs that a corporate might, but in a fraction of the time and cost.
So we've got some experience there that I'm sure will aid this discussion across all of the kind of the topics that we've prepared for. So we did a little bit of preparation for this, just to kind of really make sure that the topics that we're talking about today hit the mark for the viewers that are tuning in. But again, as I say, if there are any kind of topics or experiences or things that you guys want to ask the panel, or you've got some experiences of your own around remote and hybrid learning, we'd love to hear from you. So before I launch into the conversations today, I did a little bit of a poll across the LinkedIn community, and just to see where people were in the L&D space and what challenges they were facing. And I just wanted to share, so I'm going to share my screen, just some of the responses that we got from the poll that we did. So we asked a couple of questions, and it was, Question number one was, what makes virtual learning more challenging? And there's a couple of things that came out of that, and interesting to see the split of the response. It was 37% of the people that responded on the poll said the lack of social engagement in a virtual setting. Only 2% said that the technology itself was a bit of a limitation. Trainer capability came out at 19%. So looking at the capability of the person facilitating that discussion, and then the lack of in-person support that you get in a face-to-face environment was the highest. So there seems to be a bit of a trend in the personal interaction and the level of engagement that we're seeing are the two key riders in what makes virtual learning slightly more challenging, which we will talk about today. But the other element that came out was how much harder is virtual training and the retention of knowledge in a remote setting. And there was a bit of a conflicting view in the comments, if you want to go back and have a look at this poll. But generally, it was seen to be at 50% of those that responded on the poll thought it was much harder, and around 20% thought it was about the same. So whether no harder or no difficult, but actually there was a big contingent. About 20% of the audience said actually they do find it easier, and there might be a number of different reasons for that, which we'll talk on in today's session. And then there was just 9% that were indifferent to the camp. So I thought we'd use this as a bit of a benchmark for some of the questions that we're talking about. But I thought it was an interesting poll to be able to share and kind of maybe shape some of the conversation that we're having today, because the education technology sector, as I found out in doing some research for this, is worth about 74 million, I think it was. It might even be more than that, if I remember correctly from my poll. But it's big business. So it's growing, and it's growing significantly since obviously COVID hit, because we were forced into a digital environment. So it's not disappearing. So how we work and how we interact and how we engage with learners in a remote setting and a virtual setting probably has to adapt with it, because it's not going anywhere soon. So with that in mind, I thought it'd be interesting to start having a few questions to the panel, who are both in the digital space, and just get your understanding from, I suppose, the changes that we've seen since COVID. How has the training landscape changed for you, Mark, since COVID?
I think obviously the massive change that happened when COVID hit, when everyone sort of jumped out of their trousers going, oh my God, we actually have to do this virtually now. I mean, that was the biggest change, in that I think only people that were truly dedicated to it were embracing virtual and digital in advance of that. The majority of people continued in person. And then as everyone made that adaptation, the biggest change that I've seen, which I think is an enormously positive change, is not about people saying which is best, virtual or in person. I think the big change was that it made facilitators and trainers and people involved in learning confront the fact that chucking everything into one big workshop was not the most effective way to learn. And we were kind of forced into that virtually, because by running virtual sessions for 2 days long, that is disengaging. That doesn't work for a lot of people. So we naturally had to spread it out. And because you're spreading out and doing shorter sessions, you can't cram as much content in. So then people suddenly started considering the fact that you could separate knowledge and learning and content out for self-study, and you could use the facilitator time for good quality practice and interaction and feedback. And so that kind of embracing of learning journeys and embracing of blended learning and embracing of stretching out the learning with small bite-sized chunks has become much more of a norm than I believe it was pre-COVID. And that, I think, is one of the gifts of the virtual world. Now, that doesn't have to be done virtually. You can use all of those principles in person as well. But that's one of the biggest changes I've seen. Obviously, people have embraced technology as well. It's not just the things like Zoom and Teams, but all of the other technology that's out there that helps learning work really, really well. But the biggest change for me is the stepping back from big, sheep dip learning sessions and breaking into more manageable chunks.
And I think you've touched on something interesting there, which will come on to as part of today's session, which is around the acts of learning in session and out of session, and what's the responsibility of the learner in approaching training in a virtual setting, which we'll talk about shortly. In terms of your own views there, Russell, obviously you're in the digital space. What have you seen change in the landscape since COVID?
Yeah, so I'd echo what Mark was saying around it becoming maybe more, it could be disjointed in some organizations. It depends how well it's organized, but essentially it's little and often has kind of become the order of the day. And I think, and I'm sure we'll come on to this as the conversation progresses, but it's how you can take snippets of learning and then apply them in a real world sense. And that has become, I think, the way in which we try to embed learning, rather than maybe previously it might have been more kind of assessment led. That's how you tested whether whether knowledge was retained or not. Now I think it's the real world application that gets the top billing when it comes to testing the effectiveness of learning.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on a really interesting point there in about how we learn, the way that we learn, and how much learning has now become maybe more of that in session or on the job experience, and that assessment of learning as part of that experience, which I think will be an interesting point that we can cover in a second. But I think in looking at building and maintaining engagement in a virtual environment, Mark, I think having spoken to a number of people, that can be a challenge. If I was to ask you how you are seeing in maybe your communities and in the conversations that you're having, how people are improving on that, what would be some of your assessment on that?
I think the key word here is it's not harder, it's different. And so it requires you to do things differently to build that engagement, to keep people engaged, to get them motivated. It's not the same, like if you get together in a room physically, and natural social interactions happen, which can't necessarily happen in an orchestrated virtual session where the facilitator is the one solely in control of who you're interacting with. So your natural social interaction don't happen like they might do over the coffee table around the room as things are in breakout sessions. So it requires you to behave differently. But if you organize it differently and you focus on the engagement of the participants, it is more than achievable in the virtual world. But it does need you to plan that in, rather than maybe complacently rely on the natural interactions that happen when a group get together in a room. And I think if you plan it in and you orchestrate it and you have it as your number one priority, it's more than achievable.
Yeah. And when we think about that, so I mean, if you think about that from a facilitator of learning, so somebody who's coming into that and saying, right, I am planning for a training session, or I am planning for an engagement session with my team, versus the expectations of the learner, how do those two things differ? And what does the learner have to do versus I suppose the facilitator of that session, be it the team leader or a trainer or whoever's running that session? Where do those responsibilities and those differences lie?
Assuming this one's coming to me again, I don't think they're any different to an in-person setting in a way. Like as a facilitator, you know that whatever session you're running, whatever medium you're running it, involvement, engagement, participation is key. From a learner point of view, you know, it's more than possible to go along to an in-person session and remain quite distant from the group and remain quite distant from the interaction and be in an observation mode or be in a prisoner mode if you didn't want to be there in the first place. So it's actually not that different. My feeling is that unless you're really stuck with, you've only got half an hour with this group of people and it's a one-off intervention, for me, the building of that community and the engagement between individuals and the relationship building is the first part of that virtual learning. And I would almost separate that out and do that first and have a session all about how are we all going to engage as a group with this? We're running this virtually. Let's get to know each other. Let's work on the right behaviors and how we're going to get the most out of it, and focus on that before you get into any kind of content or learning process or journey at all.
Yeah, and I suppose it's made that training needs analysis part of the training design, and even more critical part of the journey in a virtual setting.
Yeah, I think, I don't know if it's any more critical. I think it's highlighted again. I think this is what virtual has done to us. It's sharpened everyone's awareness. And when we were having our prep talk about this, Gary, I used the word complacency in there. And I think it's very easy when you know you're getting a group of people coming to a room with you to be a little bit complacent about really high quality learning, because you know you've got them for the day, you know you can interact with them, you know you can make them like you as a facilitator, you know you can run some fun, engaging exercise. You can give them coffees and sweets and all the stuff all that kind of plethora of stuff around the side. And I think that makes some people complacent about considering high quality learning, and that need to engage with individuals, not just needs analysis for the business, but engage with individuals to understand their level of motivation for this learning. Because no great game or treat or classic icebreaker compensates for a lack of motivation in the individual learner. Yeah. They're not motivated. We're fighting a losing battle, trying to come up with something, amusing and engaging and creative in the session itself. So having that opportunity to engage with individuals and collectively as a group beforehand to get us into that motivation, to help them build that motivation and that willingness to lean into learning, means that the differences in virtual and in person become less exaggerated.
Yeah. And Russell, we spoke about the ability of learning to learn and actually getting people to think about how you approach learning differently in a virtual setting. What's your experience been of enabling that process? How do you go about that?
Yeah, it's not straightforward. I think we do cover, in fact, one of our introductory courses is exactly that. It is learning to learn and fostering curiosity. But you can take a horse to water sometimes, especially in a virtual environment. You can't always make it drink. So I think for us, the way that you can get around that is that you can try to kind of the Richard Thaler methodology. It's nudging all of the time rather than saying, right, we are all going to set aside this time and we are going to do this. It's now become much more subtle than that, I think. And both from our side as a service provider and the HR managers that we work with, who are kind of our advocates within the organizations, we now have to, yes, we encourage them to learn how to learn, which includes open-mindedness, it includes curiosity, and it includes going to things and undertaking things across a range of different topics. Because what that then does is that multidimensional thinking. It's amazing how often you can actually tie something that you learn from a leadership course to something that you learn from maybe a communications course, and actually those two pieces of information that are on the face of it unrelated. When you're then in an organization, you've had those two insights in the same short space of time, and can then apply them in a real world sense. That's how we encourage our learners to start to think more dimensionally than, okay, you're going to do 6 minutes of leadership training in one of our bite-sized module, and then you're going to put that away and never think about it again. It's trying to do that cross-fertilization of ideas so that it actually starts to create new ways of thinking.
You've said a few things there, Russell, and I've latched onto these and I've written these down. I think you've used the word cross-fertilization, which we'll touch back on when we build how we create that community of learning and how we spread that knowledge in a more disparate environment. But you've also talked there about curiosity, open-mindedness, and Mark, you touched on complacency. And I just want to pull those three things together, because I think when we approach learning virtually, and I think as a facilitator, and I've facilitated programs myself, I think it's more challenging sometimes for the trainer or the facilitator to get that group dynamic working. But I also think there is a responsibility and a commitment on the learner to approach sessions, be it virtual sessions, with more curiosity, with more of an open mind, and to put aside that complacency. Because I think there is a danger in online learning when you're at your PC and your inbox is there and it's pinging away. There is a danger that you defocus and you move your focus onto BAU. So thinking about that, how do we encourage learners and how do we support facilitators to adopt that curiosity and nurture that open-mindedness within learners so that we run really engaging and powerful sessions? Mark.
This is we could kid ourselves that we can do this in a 30-minute session where we're trying to cover off content as well, but I just simply don't think you can. I think this is all about saying, do you want this to be a high quality learning intervention where people genuinely can go and perform better and practice and embed their behaviours or not? And if you do, this is the work beforehand. A really simple process that I find works enormously well. And in most circumstances, it won't work in some context. In most circumstances, it does. And that's to start with practice. Before you start with any content, we start with group sessions, is get those individuals, either in pairs or individually, to practice whatever it is they're coming along to learn. There is no better awareness builder than someone actually trying to do something in advance. So if they're going through a coaching development program, get them to run a coaching session, either with you in smaller groups or in pairs, and get that feedback of where the gaps really are. If they're going on if they're onboarding into a contact center, there's going to be a sales team. Get them to run a sales conversation on that first session that they're there as a group. Getting that practice in where they realize the muscles they have got, they haven't got. For most people, if you tie this in with the motivational work we've done, starts to generate that curiosity. It gets rid of some of the assumptions they've made that they can do this already or that this isn't for them. And so starting with practice for me is one of the most, and I say start with practice, I'd want practice to be literally at every single stage of this journey as well. But starting with it is a really good way to build curiosity to, okay, now I'm a little bit more aware of where I've got misperceptions or I've got gaps in my ability compared to where I need to be.
Yeah. And I think that complacency piece, Russell, what's your thoughts there on people's distractions of learning? Because I think in your world, it's a digital sphere, isn't it? So actually I'm sat there and I'm doing some work and I'm tapped into an online engagement. It's easy to become distracted and move on to the BAU environment and forget that learning. How do you manage, and what's your advice for those people to manage that reduction in distractions and complacency of learning?
Yeah, so with our platform being self-paced, you could do it in your own time. You're not doing the learning as part of a group. And this is an industry trend. It's not something that we've discovered. It is the bite size, and it's about giving people 5 or 10 minutes of learning at a time, and then letting them get on with their day and coming back at another time for the next installment. I think that's the way that we have approached it. Clearly, there are thankfully, I'd say the days where you've got a 3-hour video course with lots of text and questions, and you've got built-in mechanisms that check that you're not fast forwarding or you're not reading too quickly. They're going, or they've gone. But that's how the industry has traditionally dealt with that issue. But now I think the drive is towards bite size, and that I think is the biggest part of the answer.
Yeah. And Mark, I think this is I know Russell's touched on a great point there, and I think breaking it down into bite-sized chunks is a really pragmatic way of doing that. And I think having almost like that blended learning approach where it's a bit of facilitation, some online learning, and your own curiosity, if you like, is an important one. One of the things that I've seen work particularly well, and I appreciate your input into this, is to say, right, actually gating the learning and actually having the learning session built and then having access points that almost proves that the learning has been practically evidenced through a series of gateways is another way of helping drive that engagement up front, and then testifying, or I suppose stamping that learning has been embedded. What would you say to that approach in more of a digital sense? Does that work?
I mean, there's no reason it can't work in a digital sense. I mean, it depends on the context of what they are learning to be able to do and what levels of performance you're looking for. There'll be some things that maybe don't lend itself to virtual. But in a way, whether it's the gatekeeping that says, let's just test this has happened, or actually just encouraging learning habits to ring fence time in everyone's either day or week that is dedicated to learning, which I know is a lot of businesses find very, very hard. They like to pack it all into one session, and then it's just, as you would say, BAU for the rest of the time. But actually building in specific, and it's not just content absorption, but building in practice time, building in reflection time into everyone's daily week. So learning becomes a habit, you know, it's a bit like learning to ride a bike or drive a car. You know, after a while, you get the behaviours embedded, and you don't necessarily need to be instructed or coached around it. But in the early stages of someone going through that process, absolutely. Building time slots into everyone's schedule where learning is expected to happen, and there can be support for that, whether that be virtually or in person, can generate much better habits, for sure.
And I think the point that you've touched on about time there, I think is another, particularly in the contact center environment, where we are very time conscious, and all the time that we take out is shrinkage that helps serve customers and kind of detracts from the run of the operation. That can be a challenge in any contact center. And I think one of the things that I've observed is that we run digital sessions and we condense those down because they are more digital sessions. What's the optimum time that you're seeing in your experience of being able to craft the right amount of time for a digital session without detracting from the learning experience?
That's a question about that's so. I mean, again, if you're simply referring to contact centers, and if you're referring to people that are, you know, dealing with customers all day long, and you're talking about skills that go into there, in my mind, you'd be looking at an hour and a half to 2 hours as your maximum session, probably an hour and a half being ideal. But I don't see these all as group sessions. You know, there are multiple ways that you can encourage people to learn. You can create right from the beginning accountability buddies and give them a 1 hour practice session every week where they're practicing with each other and giving each other feedback. You can create like reflective learning diaries that says, you know, after each 4 hour stint of answering calls, go in, you know, take 20 minutes out to go into your reflective learning diary and reflect on what's happened and what hasn't happened and how you've applied the learning from the previous week or whatever. So it's not all about digital learning sessions. You know, there are other things you can factor into people's week.
Yeah. And I like that what you've talked about there is that ability to reflect on learning and creating time for reflection. I think when we look at the contact center environment, the training session is the 2 hour slot that you've got booked for training. We don't necessarily look at the reflective time to understand and learn and how to work out how we're going to implement that into the contact center. I'm just going to invite Emily into the conversation because she's dropped a private note into the chat, which I think could be relevant to this topic. So Emily, take yourself off mute and
hi Gary.
So
far. So my question is, or my thing is more around, so I think there's a bit missing for me in this, and that is about the generational piece. So yeah, I get the tech bit, and I'm all about blended and all about bite-sized chunks, but the generational piece is becoming bigger and bigger, and the contact centers that I deal with and the people that I speak to, there's a big gap now between the generation that are tech and don't want as I call it, a table stopper of their notes that they're going to use to prop up their chair leg. They don't want that. They just want to have everything online, versus the other generations that are wanting different things from their learning and from their experience. And indeed, if they're not getting what they need, it's causing issues with retention, and then they're not staying further down the line. So I think that there's a bit where we've got to consider that blended approach is needed for those reasons, and how and when does that generational piece get considered and reviewed. And also as well, I think the second bit on the generational piece and the digital bit for me is also around what the culture of the business is. So there's a lot of contact centres now have got hybrid. Not all are hybrid. There's actually quite a few that have gone back to fully office based. So a digital approach for them isn't going to work. But also the tools, the digital tools, you know, I went on a call earlier today. It was all talking about Kahoot and Slido, and that, you know, what's better, which do they prefer, and sort of, unfortunately, people seeing that as a solution to a generational thing rather than just as a tool, no different than a tool we would have used 4 years ago to engage some learning.
So I think that's a really interesting point around the generational gap and how we learn in different styles and how we approach that. I'm going to ask Mark for his views, and then I'm going to come on to Russell to see if there's any differential that you've seen in certainly the customers that you're speaking to. But Mark, from your perspective, what would you say about the generational gap and how we look at training from that perspective?
I mean, I think everything that Emily said is right. So my starting point with this is you design and build learning interventions that work for the individuals that work for you, because what you really want is, this is not learning for learning's sake. It's not, we're going to use the shiny toys because the shiny toys exist now. That's starting from the wrong sort of origin point. The first origin point is who's working for us and how do we help them provide the environment for them where they can perform at their very, very best. And that's why there needs to be a huge degree of flexibility in what is offered to the people that you're working with that enables them to do their job. And so it's not, and this is almost the reverse of the complacency that might have happened pre-COVID, is like, we might now be so absorbed with our fancy shiny toys and tools that we say, we're just going to throw like this smorgasbord of technology at all of our learners because that's how people learn now. And of course it isn't. I think you start with what's the environment we're in, who are the people we're working with, what do they need to be able to do really, really well, and then you design the right solutions using the right mediums to enable them to do that. And if you've got a mixed generational workforce, you provide a mixed learning approach. You don't force people into situations where they're not going to get the kind of learning that's required to enable them to perform at their very, very best.
And Russell, from your perspective, do you see any kind of generational divide in the adoption rate for digital learning?
It's a good question, and you've got me thinking, Emily, because I think that our customers would tell you that our tone, our style is probably focused around the younger generations. I don't have the stats, like I say, but we do have customers with multi-generational workforce, and we don't necessarily see any particular patterns. I might go and have a look to see if there are any now, but I don't anecdotally feel that is the case. I think that the technology that we use and that the rest of the industry also uses, the focus on simplicity can help with that. So in terms of accessing the content, then there's not really any challenge. Basically, it's if you've got an email address and you know how to use email, you'll be able to get into what we've got to offer. And so I don't think the access is an issue, but in terms of the content that the actual courses that people complete, I will go and see if there is any trends that we can pick out of that. I don't feel so much soft skills are soft skills at the end of the day, and we often will have CEOs of organizations that are very experienced and, shall we say, longer in the tooth, that will do a lot of training around soft skills, and then we have university leavers who would do an equal amount. So I don't have much to add from a generational perspective other than say I don't see any major factor there.
But isn't it also? Oh, sorry.
Go on. Sorry, Emily, carry on.
I was just going to say, I that aside and everything I've said, the bedding in from management is the biggest thing ever. So I guess the generational gap doesn't really matter as long as the follow-up. I mean, that's probably one of my biggest frustrations as a L&D professional, is that I can create the shiniest, loveliest, most engaging, dynamic, you name the word, inspiring the lot session, and they walk out inspired and engaged, and they're still inspired and engaged with me as a person. But when they're in their organization, they haven't got that going on with their manager, and their manager's not supporting them. So they might not have their generational piece. They may not have been digging the piece around the digital bit, but they haven't had that conversation with their manager, and their manager hasn't picked up on it yet.
Yeah. And I think this links back to two elements for me there. And I think it links back to a point that Mark was making earlier, to say, right, what's the role of the leader in supporting their team with the learning interventions that's on their calendar? And I saw a recent poll from Jackie Turner about how often do you engage with your team leader before you go on a course and understand what some of those objectives are. And there is a real mix of opinions on that one. So I think that the role of the team leader in supporting their teams in that learning engagement in advance of it happening is important. And then I think the flip side to that is, once that learning engagement has happened, it's how do you test the needle, and how do you test if it's actually happened? And that whole inspecting what you expect piece is, I think, a massive area, regardless of whether we do it face to face or whether we do it digital. Say, what behavioral change are we expecting to see, And are we following up on that either through peer review or through leadership review? So it's how do you pull it all together so that the investment and the time has hit the mark? Mark, would you agree with that?
I agree. It's interesting hearing Emily point that out. I think it would be one of anyone in L&D's biggest gripes, wouldn't it? That, you know, you get everyone really up fired and motivated and with all this new stuff to put into place in whatever role they're going into. And then like the tumbleweed moments for the weeks afterwards when no one other than you is actually talking to them about it or creating engagement. So I totally get that, Emily. I'll have to tell you, over the years, my view has changed on this. So I'd say sort of the first 15 years of being involved in L&D, I tried everything I could under my skin to come up with ways of getting managers and leaders to do that follow-up. And in the end, I kind of had to step back and say, do you know what, unless, of course, there were times I came across managers and leaders that were really up for that and totally believed in it. That was awesome. I didn't have to worry about it. 75% of the time, that wasn't the case. So I changed my view a little bit and thought, actually, this is a really highly qualified part of learning. It's not just a check-in, like, what did you learn? Have you done it? And, you know, are you getting the results? Those kind of basic questions don't cut the mustard. That's just being a decent human being. And so unless you get time to develop the managers and the leaders and really build that skill set in them, that they know how to carry on the learning journey, I would suggest it stays with L&D still and stays with the facilitators and the coaching team, and that they support their managers and leaders and do that follow-up because they understand learning, they understand practice, they understand reflection, they understand about motivational dips. And it might seem like a cop-out, but if you want it done really well, you need someone who understands learning to do that embedding and follow-up. And if the leadership population, the management population are not prepared to lean into that, I would have that as part of the L&D.
And I think there's an extension to that, and it could almost be another webinar, is what's the role of the senior leadership team in embedding learning and development in the contact centre? I think we could probably debate that question for a number of hours, but we have only 20 minutes left. And Holly has asked a really interesting question, and I'm going to throw this one to you first, Russell, because it's about technology and some of the technology that you might have seen that helps support learning and development. And then I know, Mark, you will have an opinion on this as well. So Russell, Holly's question was, if I can just find it, it was embracing other technologies as well as Teams and Zooms. Any personal recommendations? So I'll come to you, Russell, and then Mark, I'll let you build on that. So Russell, anything from your point of view? Anything that you've seen that's pioneering?
Yeah, well, there's this thing called Sensei, but I might be biased.
Yeah, that might be you being a little bit biased about your own product.
Yeah. I think there are 14,000 learning management systems on the market, approximately. I haven't counted them all lately, but that's the number that gets bandied around. So you've obviously got everything there from a very simple app right the way through to some kind of enterprise solution. I think one of the main challenges is that it's not a lack of technology now, it's too much of it, and it's being able to find the ones that are going to work for your business. And without knowing more about Holly's specific goals, it's difficult for me to comment too much on anything that I've seen. LMS is, if that is the realm in which we're focused on, then clearly there's a lot more that focus now on mobile first LMSs. They can help, and again, that contributes more to the kind of little and often bite-sized learning. But Holly, I see you turned your camera on. Do you want to maybe expand on that?
I have. Hi, thank you. So, yeah, I have a small customer care team that I manage, and it's just there is just so many different forms that we have, and just trying to consolidate everything into one place and make it easier for them to like work from, as well as us to monitor that data as well.
Yeah.
Go on, carry on, Russell.
I was going to say, yeah, I think those learning management systems or learning experience systems, which are getting more, it seems to be more trendy now. I'm never sure of the difference between them, if I'm totally honest. But they should all, by and large, the good ones should enable you to manage everything in one place. If they're not, then they're not a very good one, I would suggest. And they should be able to handle the various different types of learning. So instructor-led, video, e-learning, everything like that it is standard practice that they would all be able to handle that.
Mark, from your perspective, I know you've been around for a long time. You'll have seen a few different types of technology. Is there any kind of technologies that have caught your eye that could help Holly in this scenario?
Yeah, so not so much focusing on the LMSs, but the other technology that can help in learning interventions, I think, is what I was referring to. And there's a really, I don't know as many as 40,000, there's a wide variety out there. My principle with technology always is that it's got to be really easy to use and access. You don't want to create barriers to your participants by making it challenging. So, for example, if you've got an in-person session, normally most facilitators are competent enough to use flip charts and whiteboards. So if you're running virtually, you want something simple like a Jamboard to use where you can get people engaging and sharing ideas on there. So something like that. And there's lots of different whiteboard tools out there that can be used. In terms of virtually, I'd mentioned Zoom and Team, which is obviously the mainstream version for everyone, but there's quite a few new products coming onto the market that replace those as well. One in particular, who I've not got any connection to, but their starting point was from running workshops, whereas Zoom and Teams were starting point was running meetings. And then they've been adapted to run for learning sessions, whereas Butter, which is a relatively new, they've been around for about 3 or 4 years, their starting point was as running workshops, and their remit is around running learning sessions. So they've built a virtual equivalent of Zoom and Teams that is particularly engineered to run engaging learning sessions. And so it gives them, in my mind, gives them a bit of a head start over the likes of Zoom and Teams, which is a meeting tool that's being adapted, if you like. It's a bit like when you walk into a boardroom and you try and adapt it into an engaging learning space. It's not really been built for an engaging learning. So Butter's one to look out for, but there's lots of new ones coming online that are specifically around learning. And then it's almost thinking again about what do you want to achieve in that learning session, and is there some kind of tool that we can use, like Mentimeter, a lot of people use for their polls and questionnaires and other areas. So there's lots of things out there, but it's not about, again, trying to put 40 different shining tools into this session. It's like, do I need to do something in my virtual session that would be run better if I had some kind of easy to access, easy to use tool that could facilitate it, a bit like we use a flip chart to capture ideas in a training room or a whiteboard or anything like that.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on some really key parts there, because I think there's 2 elements, isn't there? There's the knowledge, the harvesting of knowledge and the store of knowledge, which sounds like Holly's looking at as to how do I capture one-to-ones, development plans, PDPs, all that kind of fun stuff. And then there's the actual engagement of the session in the session to maximize the retention of the learning, which I think the use of Jamboards, Mentimeter, polls, all those kind of things really absolutely helps. And I've used those in the past. And once you've gotten over the technology hurdle from the delegates trying to explain how to use it, sometimes you're then there and it kind of continues to evolve. So I think that's a really good shout. And we've got opportunity for any other questions. So if there are any other questions, please do drop a note into the chat and we can pitch the question to either of our panelists. I've got another question while we do that, and it's around the gamification of the learning process, especially in an online environment. It's becoming more of a thing to gamify everything, including learning engagement. And I know, Russell, from your point of view, there are specific things that you look at as part of the gamification process. And I was just interested in your views on how far do we take gamification of learning before it becomes obstructive? Yeah,
so a lot of the challenges that we talked about earlier on around getting the engagement and tackling the presenteeism in our world, one of the tools that we've got that are most readily available to us is gamification. You do have to use it sparingly, and it doesn't work for everybody by any stretch of the imagination. We think that some of the gaming elements that we've built into our learning platform account for somewhere between 20 and 25% of the activity comes about as a result of the gamification. So leaderboards, internal leaderboards for us is probably the biggest thing. we hope that we attract willing soldiers, people that go onto our platform because they want to learn, but knowing that they're on a leaderboard that everyone else can see can sometimes give them a little additional incentive. But you're right, it can become obstructive, and it can, in the same way as you can turn up to an instructor-led session face-to-face and just pay it lip service, you can go online and more easily so probably click through a bunch of screens until you get to the end, just so that you appear a couple of places higher on the leaderboard. So it's not the answer to everything. It's certainly a feature, and I think it's one that's here to stay. I think Duolingo has that type of environment, have nailed it, and I've got my eye on it, and we will certainly be looking at what else we can do from a gamification.
It's interesting, isn't it? It's gaming the system versus cheating the system, and the difference. Mark, what's your thoughts on gamification in the training and development space?
I mean, I'd add to what Russell says, really. I think my number one thought is, again, like any of the tools we talked about, is not saying, oh, this is the latest thing, so I've just got to build games into everything I do. And it's saying, for this particular content or subject matter or this particular group of learners, gamifying that learning process will work particularly well. And actually, it's a relatively newish phrase for the most mainstream in L&D. But if you go back 10 years and talk to someone who's running really effective facilitation sessions, they'd probably describe an exercise they were doing that when you take a step back, you say, oh, that's like you played a game sort of thing. Yeah, that's right, we did. But they didn't call it gamification. It was just a way of helping learning to happen. So the reason it's been more formalized into a phrase now is because there's some absolutely amazing technology out there which can help people build really good visual game-like experiences. And because they're digital, they're available individually, on demand, whatever. So it's a bit different than requiring a sort of experienced facilitator to build something in. But I think that gamifying an idea of learning has been around for a long time. It's just now there's much more variety out there. And I think I saw a post yesterday where there's a lot of sort of no-code gaming solutions out there now, so that actually anyone without even the experience of coding can start building an online game or card deck to support their learning. So there's some amazing stuff out there, but that doesn't mean it's always the answer. As Russell says, it's not always the answer. It's making the right choices for the right situation.
And I think it's about using that gamification to reinforce habits and behavioral change. I think that's the key bit. I think if you can nail that, and to your point, Mark, really reinforce the learning at a critical point so it becomes something that then sticks and retains, gamifying that element, I suppose, could be a really great way of blending the two together. We've got a couple of comments in the chat that I want to pull out. One is a comment from Jennifer, and then I want to talk about a comment from Jonathan, who's looking for a little bit of advice on a scenario that he's recently faced. So Jennifer talks about going back to leadership and embedding new skills and training following the sessions. And she asked, do you ever set plans for leadership teams to follow to make sure that learning is correctly embedded and used going forward? So I think it kind of builds on some of the points that we've made. What's your take on that, Mark? And then Russell, I'd be interested to know what your clients and people that you work with are doing in that space. So Mark, what's your comment first?
I guess 3 key points. Firstly, they have to be very heavily involved before the training or learning happens, so that they know exactly what is being built in terms of performance abilities and behaviours. So then there's no sort of blank faces when their team or staff come out of the learning session. As in what embeds it afterwards, in my mind, there's 3 things of, if they are aware of what is being learned and what performance is expected, then they can have feedback sessions, they can provide coaching. But the 2 things I would embed in any structure of this would be deliberate practice sessions and reflection sessions, like I said. So it's not just a case of ticking off a sheet, say, yeah, they've said this, they've elicited this, I've seen this behavior. I'm not a big fan of that being the way you embed it. You embed it through good quality learning practices and practice, reflection and feedback, that kind of loop of embedding. If you've got a team leader and a leadership team that will manage that for you, fantastic. If not, like I said with Emily's point, I would leave that in the L&D space to make sure that, because I don't think it's a separate part. It's not post-learning, it's not post-training, it's still learning. And so it sits with experts of how you manage learning.
And Russell, from your perspective, what have you seen in your space that helps embed the learning process?
Yeah, so in our instance, our we are working with a HR leader within an organization, and they are essentially our kind of eyes and ears on the ground. We deliver the learning, and then we're getting feedback via that HR leader, and so we kind of have to tailor the approach on a case-by-case basis. But the best examples where it works really well is when that HR leader is then setting up their own workshops, maybe follow-on learning, maybe instructor-led learning, because they've realized that as a group there's a collective skills gap, or there's a collective curiosity about a certain topic. So they'll maybe look to advance that with some instructor-led training. So it is difficult. We are removed from that process, and it is a challenge for us. But I think through working with the business, we can get a general sense of if the learning is having an impact. And the best thing for us is when you get the senior leadership within an organization doing the content, doing the courses themselves, and again, their name appearing on the leadership board, it all of a sudden gives a big green light to everybody else that actually not only they're encouraged to do it, but they're expected to do it.
Leading by example, Russell. Who'd have thought of that?
It's a thing.
I want to round off the session with the scenario that Jonathan's tabled in the chat. I'm just going to invite yourself to take yourself off mute, Jonathan, and just share your example, because this is exactly why I wanted to run this session, because it's a case of we've run an in-person session and then we've run it virtually, and it's had it's not had the impact that we'd hoped. So Jonathan, just share with us your example, and then we'll get some advice from the panelists and anybody else on the call that's got a thought. So over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Yeah, so I was asked to run a training session by a client, and I was running it twice. I was running it live in person, then I was running it online, because some of the online people were lots of different offices across the UK, so bringing them together online, whereas one group of people were all in the same office. So I delivered it all on the first session. It was a full one-day session. I delivered it to the people in person. It went down really well. Everyone was really engaged. I had lots of discussion with people. I broke people into little groups to kind of talk through kind of almost quiz type things, and then feedback and talk to it as a group. And everything went really great. And then I had to do it again, so about a week later, but online. And I tried to make it as much as like the live session, the in-person session, as I could. So I made sure that I was in a kind of probably well-lit room and everything. I was standing up when I was doing the presentation, so I wouldn't lose that kind of almost animation and engagement, by sitting down in the corner. I made sure I could see everyone by making sure I had two large screens. So I had the gallery of everybody on one page on one screen, and another screen I had a thing so I could see exactly what they could see. And I put myself on an in-person thing, so there was almost like I was presenting it in front of the slide to make it look like I was kind of standing there as well. But it just didn't seem to it just didn't seem to go down as well. People were less engaged. I wasn't, I was asking questions and it would just be silence. The only way I could do the breakout sessions was to put them in breakout rooms, so they were only really discussion amongst themselves. I had to try and jump into rooms, which for shorter discussions didn't really work. And I could even feel it dragging on myself, even though I was doing things largely the same way. And so I don't know whether it's because I thought maybe I should have a tougher crowd, but then I had to do a similar thing with another session, and it was almost reversed. So people I delivered to live on one session, I delivered online with a different training, and I almost got the same thing. So I don't know whether it's the fact that when you switch from a live in-person environment to a virtual one, the atmosphere kind of changes, and so things that you do when you're presenting don't quite work the same online, or whether maybe something changed in the way I presented that I didn't
So
know
Jonathan, I'm going to invite some thoughts and reflections from Mark and Russell, and if anybody else has got any thoughts and reflections, please drop them into the chat so Jonathan can take some thoughts away. But Mark, what's your thoughts based on Jonathan's scenario there? Any advice?
I don't want to sound like I'm judging anything you've done, Jonathan, but just based on the information you've given me, it sounds a little bit like, although you've made the effort to translate it to virtual, that it's been run in a very similar way. And unfortunately, the virtual session do need to be run differently to the in-person session. I'm not saying you would have got the same level of engagement. It's hard to judge on the groups of people you're working with. I certainly wouldn't have run it for the same amount of time virtually as you ran it in person. I'd have separated it out. I'm also a big believer in, if you're going to get people onto a virtual platform, and this is just a personal choice, I wouldn't spend time with slides. You want to spend maximum time engaging them. So I would almost share the slides in advance, share knowledge in advance, get them doing the knowledge bit of the learning up front. And when they're with you, they get the advantage of you. You can focus entirely in on them then, rather than the content and the slides. A little bit different to when they're with you and you've got that natural social interaction that you've got in a room that's in person. There's a list of other things you can do differently that's out there, but they do have to be viewed very differently. Even though you're doing the same content to a similar group of people, you have to structure and plan it differently based on the different medium that you're using, for sure.
Okay.
Russell, any additional points on that?
Yeah, so you actually pointed out, made me realise, Jonathan, that despite me being in the tech space, I've done in-person sessions before. I've never actually delivered a training session online, which I've only just realised. And I could tank it face-to-face as well, so I'm not sure I can add too much to that.
Brilliant. I think Mark's given some really great tips there, Jonathan. And I'd be happy to catch up with you another time and talk through some of the stuff that I do, because I think I share your pain. I've been in similar situations. But listen, that is literally all we've got time for. That hour absolutely flew by. If anybody else has got any thoughts or reflections, please do feel free to reach out to Mark for anything around GiraffePad and anything about the online learning community that Mark generates. And Russell is prime and open to have any further conversations about blended learning, online learning, e-learning, LMS platforms, which I will let you all reach out independently for. But until next week, not next week, until next time, next month, I will say goodbye. I'll just ask Mark and Russell just stop so I can say thank you, but I'll let everybody else leave the session and see you again next month. Thanks, folks.
Thanks all.
Thank you.